So can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, greetings, everyone. I hope you are all here for a little bit of information on making compost. I'm going to focus on pretty much very simple backyard composting. I know some of you might have made some compost elsewhere in the country. It's quite similar here, except for a few key things to think about to make you successful. Now, to start with, what is compost? So sorry we're not face-to-face to have these interactions, but basically compost is decomposed organic matter. So that would be plant material primarily for our backyard composting. In nature, decomposition occurs with both plant and animal material. Your composting can be as simple as you'd like, or it can be very technical and complicated. I know we all have different personalities, and perhaps your approach to composting would follow your personality. Some people like to get into all the details and be very precise, and other people would rather just, throw some things in and, give it some water and turn it now and then. Either way, you'll get nice material to use in the future for your vegetable and herb gardens or for enriching the soil surface around your desert landscape plants. But just figure out a system that will work for you. These are some things that you should think about before you get started. How much time will you have, or would you be willing to put into your decomposition effort? Think about physical activity that's required in different approaches. Some of us might, enjoy getting that workout when we're working with our compost. Other people might have some, restrictions that would then guide you towards another type of approach or bin. So definitely you need to think about the materials you have available. Some people think, well, I don't have enough to compost. You can scavenge. You can go around and certainly find suitable materials in your community or neighborhood. First off, think about what type of a physical system you want to have. We recommend that you start with about a cubic yard, so 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, or even larger, of material. That will make your composting the most successful. If your system is too small, you don't have enough material, it's going to be more difficult to hold heat and moisture, which makes the process faster. I guess I was going to say in the long run, but it would make it faster in the short run. The size of your system will take into account how much space you have within your yard and also the amount of materials you'll be able to process. Your system might be just a heap. Here we see two examples. In the upper left, there is a huge heap of organic material that's decomposing. It has a little bit of a backdrop on two sides with some old pallets. This is just a heap next to a fencing around a garden, a vegetable garden area. No matter what sort of bin or heap you're going to work with, don't be concerned so much with tidiness or aesthetics, but no matter what, you should not be needing a gas mask or have the odor be so horrible that skunks just fall over. If you're working your compost system properly, there shouldn't be a bad odor that you would be able to discern from the decomposition. So let's look at some bins. Remember, you want to have at least overall a cubic yard of material. So you want to start with an enclosure, if you're going to use a type of enclosure, that would be at least 3 foot wide and about 3 foot tall. Remember height. If you're not able to like pick up the bin enclosure and set it aside, or if it doesn't have an opening of any sort, you want to make sure that the height is workable. So I'm not very tall, so I would not want to have a system that's a bin that's over 3 foot tall. If you're a 7 foot tall basketball player, that would be a little different perhaps. But just think about the size. Also, whether it will be stationary or movable. So movable structure would be one that, as I mentioned, you could pick it up and set it aside or move it from one area of your yard to another. Stationary, it's built, it's going to stay right there. If the bin is stationary, definitely, it's very helpful to have some system of removable panels or slats or a gate that could swing open and closed that will make working overall easier. So again, that height factor here, that might be a little more difficult for a shorter person to work the material if this were a solid front, but this has slats that can be removed. This is a nice visually pleasing panel that is just set across the front of this 2-bin composting system. It's made of fence slats and 2x4s. It's just hooked onto the sides of that system so it can very easily be unlatched and just easily set aside to get in to work the material. In this example, you can see the nails there. This is stationary. Just remember, you want it to be low enough that you can work the material. This, some systems might have, such as this, have 2 slats that you could slide those boards up and down, add more or take some off. This was a huge composting system at the Cooperative Extension some years ago. Because it was so huge, they made actually a couple of panels vertically that would slide in and out of these metal runners. Had some little handles there to make it easy to move them. So just think about, what type of a system will work so that you can easily reach the materials. Now, your bins can be open-sided or more enclosed, but they cannot be airtight. Air is super important in the process of decomposition in our general backyard composting system. So just looking at advantages and disadvantages, that's with everything in life, isn't it? Open-sided bins have better aeration, and air is necessary for the process, but it dries out faster, especially during the summer months here. It will definitely dry out more quickly, the materials. Also, it will lose heat faster in our winter months, especially. Looking at enclosed systems, you do have decreased aeration, but there is still aeration. All of these bins have slits or little slots that will allow air to get into the material. The advantage, especially during the hot, dry months, is that the material will hold moisture longer in an enclosed system and also retains heat longer during the colder months. If animals are a concern, whether they be domestic or wild creatures, then you probably want to go with an enclosed system rather than something such as this that animals could easily get in there and access the compost. Some examples of different styles, more of the open system. You can just get some hardware cloth and make it into a circular enclosure. You'd want to have galvanized so that it won't rust very readily. You could use chicken wire. The problem there is the size of the openings. Hardware cloth, you can get it with openings that are 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch or sometimes even smaller. Chicken wire, usually it's over 1 inch in width and height, the opening. Materials can more easily fall out of or sift out of the larger chicken wire framing, but it could be used perhaps for stockpiling materials, which we'll talk about. But either way, very easy to just get a stretch of that material and make it into a cylinder. This is a rather fancy enclosure made out of this metal screening material used in construction projects and metal posts. Somebody got really fancy. This is all welded together very beautifully. It's in a community garden. Wonderful two bin system that gives you a lot of versatility in how you work the material. They even, for safety, capped those metal posts so that nobody would get scratched by them. Now keep this beautiful bin in mind. I'm going to refer to it in a little while. An example of repurposing some wooden pallets. In this example, they're just made into 2 rows at a 90-degree angle to hold as a backdrop for this heap. Here, in this example, you've got a few different bin sections that were created with these pallets. This is one that is 4 pallets wired together. They did make the wiring on one pallet such that it's very easy to unwire it to remove one of the panels to get into the material very easily. Do think about the material that the pallets are made out of. Some, such as pine, are more rot resistant. We will want to keep the organic matter that we're decomposing in a moist condition. So it's probably better if you can find some type of material that will be longer lasting. Some pallets have very wide spaces between the slats, which would allow for a lot of material to just kind of filter out, which might be a nuisance. Other pallets, especially I think they're paint pallets, have more closely spaced boards and will hold material more easily. Even if you do have pallets that have wide spaces, you can work around that. If you have some old window screens, or in this case, it's old shade cloth that's repurposed, and just put around the sides of those wooden panels there, and that keeps the material from falling out, but allows great aeration and works very, very well. You could actually build an enclosure using wood. Again, thinking in terms of wood that will be resistant to decay. Great material to use would be cedar or redwood. Those have a higher cost up front, but will last for several years. So over time, it's not that expensive to use that quality of wood. The treated wood, depending on the type, previously wood would be treated with a chemical trio that included arsenic. Since we do want to keep the organic matter moist, there would be a potential for that to kind of leach the arsenic out of the treated wood. If we're going to be using the compost for our vegetable garden or edible herbs, you'd probably want to steer away from that to avoid those potential toxins from being a part of your compost. You could use straw bales. Eventually they will decompose, but since the straw bales are so compact, the material is just really, really dense, it will take a while, usually at least a few years, for them to get to the point where they're going to be falling apart and you've lost your enclosure. I shouldn't say lost your enclosure, but the enclosures become part of your compost. Cinder blocks can be used. This is another example from a community garden showing somebody doing great handiwork here, very precise arrangement of those cinder blocks. They did leave spaces between the blocks to allow for some air to get in from those three sides. You could repurpose old dilapidated, those poor rejects. Instead of sending them to the landfill, you could gather, cinder block pieces and create an enclosure that way also. There are commercial plastic enclosures that are very easy to use. Both of these are literally just sheets of plastic that you would make into a cylinder, just like the hardware cloth or chicken wire. The holes in those fairly thick sheets of plastic will allow for great aeration. This example actually is intended to be used for growing potatoes, but in the off season, you could use it to run your compost or stockpile, gather materials that will then be incorporated into your compost system. This is intended for composting. It's pretty cool. The sheet of plastic is large enough that you can open it up to get a 5-foot diameter bin, or you can close it down to 3-foot diameter if you didn't have as much material. So it's kind of neat, allowing you flexibility depending on how much material you have at a particular time of year. There are little pins that you would remove just to enlarge it or make it smaller. Many of our municipalities in the valley offer compost bins in the form of repurposed old trash or recycling bins. City of Chandler does participate in this program. If a bin gets a wheel broken off or it cracks, somehow it's no longer useful for a resident, then the city will clean them out, drill holes in them for aeration, and offer them to residents for use in composting. So if you're interested in that, you can check with our solid waste department and get a free bin. Now, so many ways that these can be adapted. You can use them right side up, upside down, with a lid, without one. You can just make it your own style. There are also commercial plastic bins. These are generally recycled plastic, which actually endures for very many years. I've had one of these for over 20 years, and it's gotten a little bit rickety, but it's still, standing tall and has not fallen apart by any means yet. So don't be afraid to invest in these products that you see are made out of recycled plastic, because even in our harsh environment, with the sun beating down, extreme temperatures, they will last for perhaps decades. Each of these has some system for allowing air to enter. There are slats on this one. This one has some slats under these little ridges. This has some vertical slats spaced out around the perimeter of that bin. A lot of them also have little doors towards the bottom if you need to get in there to remove some materials or mix materials. And of course, a lid. You can use tumblers that are built on an axis, a frame with an axis that you can just rotate it and mix your materials, which might be a good thing depending on your ability or desire to get in there with a shovel or pitchfork or things like that. This is another possibility. This is a larger scale tumbler than the previous examples. It sits on a large frame which has rollers, and you can crank this so that it rotates when you want to mix the material. Nice heavy duty system here. It's made out of metal that the sides of the bin roll on the rollers there. And it, of course, has holes for allowing air to enter. You have a lot of options. Just remember, for our basic, easy backyard composting, we don't want to work with pits. If you dig a pit and throw your materials in, you're not going to get the best aeration. And it has happened. I remember, what was it, 2014, September, a lot of areas of the valley got about 5 inches of rain within a 24-hour period. If you had your organic material in a pit, that would be a soggy and stinky mess. So it becomes anaerobic. There's not air in surrounding material for the microorganisms to function, so it gets pretty rank smelling. So avoid pits. Looking at different options, whether you have just one section or compartment or 2 or 3, you do have flexibility. If you have enough space in your yard, I would certainly suggest having at least 2 sections to work with. The flexibility that it gives you is you can approach that in different ways. With 2 sections, what you could do is have your material that's decomposing. You turn it and water it and everything, and you're letting that decomposition process work through over time. Then you could use the other section to add newer material to. Just keep adding new material over there, while this one side, you're just focusing on a finished product. You could also use the two bin system, have all your material in one. You could add new materials over time, but what you would do is when it's time to aerate, you would move everything that's here into the other section. So just by moving it, that's going to mix air in and take care of your aeration. So 2 different approaches. With 3, you could kind of combine those 2 concepts. If you have a smaller yard, though, you can certainly get your compost from finish to start with just one bin or 1 compartment. Thinking of the location for your composting process, make sure it's easily accessible. I think that is one of the most important things in deciding where to put your compost. If it's too difficult to get to, too far away, or you have to go through an obstacle course to get to it, you're going to be less likely to add material to your compost. Make it so that it's an easy go from your kitchen or prime garden work areas, and also make sure you have enough space around your bin to maneuver. This was a friend's yard. They had a rotating bin that they themselves built. They're very do-it-yourselfers, very much. They had this adjacent to their vegetable and herb garden, but yet it was easy to get from the kitchen back there and from other areas of the yard to add materials to that composting system. This was in my backyard where I used to live. I'm a plant nerd, I admit. So my very, very, very small yard was overstuffed with plants, plants that I just had to have. And of course, being a horticulturist, I knew better, but just had to have this wonderful, wonderful little leaf cordia, which I knew would get huge. Well, within a few years, it got so large, it was very difficult. It was a challenge to get over to the compost bin, and certainly it was only accessible from one little stretch along one wall side. That wasn't smart. So eventually I had to, be reasonable and remove that shrub and put something smaller in scale in its place. This system is right outside of a vegetable garden area. So easy, you can come out with your trimmings and this and that from the vegetable garden and just boom, right there. It was also a very easy route from their kitchen to add those kitchen scraps to the compost as well. Other super important thing is make sure you have access, easy access to water. Okay, you're going to need to keep the material moist. If you don't have easy access to the water, that's not going to work well. Even if you have kids, they're only going to fall for hauling water, in a bucket to the compost bin for, so many times before they catch on to you and they'll say, nah, sorry, not going to do that anymore. You can also think in terms of, so make sure it's near a hose or spigot, and make sure that the ground is fairly level. You don't want to, if you have a sloped property, don't put it at the bottom of the slope. Again, just like working in a pit. But you can have a surface underneath the compost bin. It's not required. You could have it right on the ground. That's not a problem at all. This is perhaps tidier and easier to get right down to the very bottom material with a flat-edge shovel when you're trying to turn the more finished product. But thinking in terms of that access to water, that example of that beautifully welded metal bin that was in the community garden, fabulous job. It was in a location that to get that material moistened, you had to run around other areas of that community garden, grab 3 hoses and connect them together to reach that compost bin. And you can imagine that did not happen frequently enough. So although it was beautiful and it was in a spot, kind of out of everybody's way, it was too far away from a water spigot, from a hose bib. So that is really important to think about. If you have trees in the yard, try to keep your compost as far away from the tree. The reason being is even if it's the most drought-tolerant desert native tree, those roots are going to take advantage of moisture that's nearby. They will soak up all the water that they can get, and it's just not going to work for encouraging healthy growth of your trees. Also, if you are lazy like myself, oh, you're getting all kinds of confessions this evening, and you don't turn your material often enough, the roots will tend to start growing up through that organic matter. And after you've waited too long to turn it, it becomes very, very difficult to turn it, because getting in there with a shovel, you've got to work through all those roots, that network of roots that's gone up through it. So it's not healthy for the trees and can potentially make it difficult for you to mix your materials. So you're better off not having it near too close to a tree or large shrub specimen. Should you have it in the sun or the shade? Well, I'd say that's not very critical. Certainly during the summer, if it's in full sun all day, it's going to dry out faster, but overall, that might be a difference of a day or two. Not that great. In the winter, if it's in the shade for all day or a portion of the day, it will lose heat more quickly, but those microorganisms usually here in the valley they'll keep working to a certain degree, but it's going to be a particular class of microorganisms that will be working primarily. So you will get decomposition, it just won't be very fast. But I wouldn't let whether it's sun or shade be a real huge factor in determining where to put your compost. I'd say ultimate in importance would be, is it easy to access, and can you get water to it easily? Regarding aesthetics, you could of course, if you're concerned with aesthetics, you're not just going to have a heap that's visible, especially if you have visitors to your garden that might not be into composting like you are. This was in a friend's backyard. They had 2 of the refurbished city bins that were actually cut down a little bit shorter than what they usually are for their sons. They had 2 boys. They each had their own compost bin. So there would be, no, clashing of who got to turn their compost or who got to put stuff in it. They were both maintaining their own very own compost system. So it was really cool. It's enclosed, it's very tidy, even though their patio area for entertaining and hanging out was close. It wasn't offensive in any way. In this garden example, their home, the back of their home and their patio was over this way. Certainly this bin isn't unsightly, but to make it a little more fun looking and a little bit more camouflage, they used some of this picket fence material around the sides of it. So now the process, getting down to the real nitty-gritty. For creating finished compost, decomposed organic matter, you need to think of it basically as a living organism that needs food, water, and air. If you provide all of these 3 essentials, the workers will come. If you build it, they will come. The food is going to be the material that you put into the compost. We think in terms of 2 food sources, carbon and nitrogen, or browns and greens, or dry and moist. You need a ratio of at least 3 to 1. You do not need to get obsessed or hung up on the ratio of the material, but you do need to have both carbon and nitrogen. Overall, we want to have a little bit more carbon than nitrogen, but you don't have to be precise. You could be if you would like to. And that's going to provide a good mix or blend of material for the composting process. Let's take a look at sources of carbon for your compost. This would be dry, leafy, or woody material. If you're gathering up dead leaves in your yard, stockpile them and use them in your compost bin. It would be great if some of those leaves would remain in the yard to decompose in place and kind of regenerate the material in the soil. But if you have to use a leaf blower, don't send that material, those leaves that you blow, to the landfill. Keep them to compost. Dried winter ryegrass clippings are great to use. You will discover I have a paranoia when it comes to Bermuda grass in composting for the use in vegetable and herb gardens. If you intend to use your finished compost for your turf areas and nothing else, then it wouldn't matter at all. But Bermuda grass, if you've ever tried to remove it from an area where you did not want Bermuda grass, you know it can be a nightmare. So I'm always paranoid and don't want to create a situation where I will be planting inadvertently Bermuda grass that I would then have to later battle to get rid of it. So dried winter ryegrass, that ryegrass, it's not as strong. Its growth structure or growth habit is very different from Bermuda grass, so it's totally safe. You could also use straw. It would be a good thing to know the source of your straw. You don't want straw that has a lot of Bermuda grass seed and seed heads in it that could potentially become Bermuda grass in your garden. Also, also you could use chipped or shredded materials from landscaping, from tree pruning. Now, if you don't have enough of your own and a chipper of your own, get to be buddies with a landscape service that you see in your area frequently. If they have a chipper that they, bring with them for jobs of pruning, I'm sure they would be happy to drop a load outside of your driveway for you to use. Most likely that is what they will do. They will drop a load. That whole bin that they've filled with chip material, they're probably going to drop the whole thing. Otherwise, you would have to really maybe get to really know them well and request that you could show up with a garbage can when you need it and get this material. It's going to be very rough, just chipped, shredded branches and trunks of trees. This is a great source of carbon. Also, wood shavings. Make sure it's not treated wood though. Coffee filters. The filters themselves are more so a source of carbon. The coffee grounds inside are a different story. Now, none of these materials are going to be 100% carbon or 100% nitrogen, but we're just kind of making the categories. Those things, the dried, brown, woody materials, those things that have a higher percentage of carbon in their composition versus those that have more nitrogen as their composition. So you do have in your handout a little chart that kind of gives you an idea of the ratios of the carbon to nitrogen material, but nothing's totally one or the other. Looking at our coffee filters, they would be more so a source of carbon. Also, tea bags, that little bag, as long as it's not those fancy mesh bags that you would get those real gourmet teas in, you can throw those in the compost. Oftentimes they have a paper tag on them that could go into the compost. If that string that attaches the bag to the little tab, if that's cotton, that can go in. Now, those little tiny staples, they won't readily decompose, but they're so small that it wouldn't be a problem to throw those in with the tea bag. I guess one of those things, I'm obsessed, so I remove that tiny little staple before I put my tea bags in the compost. Shredded up newspapers can go into your compost, and torn up paper bags also. The egg cartons that are made out of that press board or cardboard, perfect for breaking up and putting in the compost. The styrofoam egg cartons, however, will not decompose. Those you do not want to incorporate into your compost system. We do have a lot of service materials these days that are made out of various organic materials, such as bamboo or sugarcane, corn, tapioca, palm leaves. These are compostable, but they're more so decomposed in commercial processes that are, hotter and whatnot compared to what we have in our backyard bins. You can certainly throw these in, but just expect that it's going to take them a long time, most likely, to break down and adequately decompose. I think a lot of us have seen or have received a beverage in one of these cups. It's not plastic, so you do not have that triangular recycle symbol, but a round symbol indicating that it is decomposable or compostable. Some of the plates that are available as well. I thought this was pretty cool, a burrito wrap made from unbleached compostable paper. Saving the planet one burrito at a time. Kind of fun, and it just makes us think, I think, about the materials that we're using on a regular basis and how they might affect our landfill versus being able to be decomposed or repurposed in some other fashion. So these are compostable items, but in our backyard systems, it's going to take them 6 months, a year, or maybe even more to fully break down. Sometimes our flatware is compostable, or this is a bowl from a soup mix where you just add your hot water and then you've got your soup for lunch. It has a little symbol that tells you that it's organic matter that's biodegradable. And I tried one of these, and after about, I think, 9 months, it wasn't really decomposing, but it was like eggshell thin. So it was wearing down gradually. There are some bags available these days that are, compostable. Again, it's going to take that a while to really break down, but overall, better for the environment, I'd say. Those are just some of the sources of carbon material that can go into your compost. Remember, we want to have, I'd say, approximately 3 parts of the carbon materials or carbon food for your compost organism, and about 1 part of nitrogen. Some references you might come across can vary greatly. I think some of Rodale's materials, which is, they're a wealth of information for great organic gardening. I think they recommend 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. But overall, if you've got both and it's approximately 3 to 1, you should get a great finished material. Looking at the nitrogen or green or wet or moist materials now, these are kitchen scraps, a great source. If you're cutting up some zucchini perhaps for a stir fry, you know, the stem end and the tail end of that zucchini, when you chop those off, they can go into the compost. If you've chopped up the rest of your zucchini, put it in your wok to cook it, you'll lightly saute it with whatever condiments. You're not going to want to put in any of those leftovers in your compost bin though. Most likely you've used at least a little bit of oil, maybe even some component with salt in it. And we don't want oil going into our compost. And our soils around here do not need any more salt. So just the fresh, uncooked material. If you feel that you're not having adequate nitrogen sources from your own daily activities, you could make some friends with somebody at a juice bar. I'm sure they would be happy. These real dense materials that come out of their juicers, that leftover pulp and fiber, they've got to get rid of it some way. So if you show up with a 5-gallon bucket, I bet they would be more than happy to fill it. Now you don't want to go in, you know, at their peak hour of business, but stopping by when it's a little slower, I bet they'd fill your bucket with a smile. Nitrogen source would be from coffee grounds. Now with your, oops, sorry. There we go. So the filter is primarily a carbon source. The coffee grounds are more so a source of nitrogen. If you're not a coffee drinker, do not worry. A lot of our coffee shops will happily share their brewed coffee grounds with you. Starbucks, for instance, they receive their coffee beans in these foil pouches, quite large. I think they must hold like 5 pounds of coffee beans. Once they've ground and brewed that coffee in shop, they save those containers, or those bags, and refill them with the brewed coffee grounds. A lot of times they'll seal that up and have it in a bucket or basket, probably right near the doorway. You can just come in, grab a bag or two at any time. Other situations, again, if you're not going in when they're at their peak hour of activity, you could probably go in with a 5-gallon bucket and they would be happy to fill it for you. Fresh winter ryegrass. The dried winter ryegrass clippings were on the carbon source list. If it's fresh cut ryegrass, that would be more of a nitrogen source, especially if it's fresh cut green Bermuda grass. I would say no, 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 no. Bermuda grass is so tough and resilient. It's practically indestructible. If you have fresh cut Bermuda, Bermuda can spread by these above ground runners we call stolons at every node point where grass leaves come up. Roots go down, and that's even if you just have a segment of that runner, it could survive in your compost and sprout up and be a nightmare. Also, fresh cut or the dried, if your Bermuda has grown so much that it's flowered and is producing seed, that's really a risk. You would have to make sure your compost got to such a high temperature that it would kill off that grass seed. Young weeds that haven't flowered yet, throw those in. Also, hair from yourself or pets can go in as a source of nitrogen. And manure. Not all manure is created equally. It depends on the diet of the beast. We want to use pretty much manure from vegetarians, not vegetarian humans, no. But cows, horses, goats, sheep, their diet is going to be grains or grasses, things like that. Even chickens you could use. Some chickens, depending on how they're raised, they will eat anything, but a lot of them, they're fed grain. Do not use manure, the feces of our domestic pets, cats, dogs, or birds. Those are creatures that can easily spread disease. Their feces might contain pathogens or even parasites that we don't want to introduce to our compost system. If you're going to incorporate manure into your compost system, make sure that it's fully composted before you add it into your vegetable or herb beds. And that will better ensure that you're preventing possible Salmonella or Listeria or E. coli from being introduced into the soil. We definitely don't want to risk that. So make sure that manure is fully decomposed. Also, more at risk would be our root crops. The cool season when we're growing beets and carrots and turnips, things like that are right in the soil. They're a greater risk of those pathogens, being carried onto them. Or low growing plants, especially again during the winter, our lettuces and things like that. They're right there just above the ground compared to tomatoes that are going to be produced higher up from the soil line. If you have manure that isn't sufficiently decomposed also, the salts that it carries can burn plant roots. And that's another thing I mentioned, know your source of straw, because you don't want straw with a lot of Bermuda grass in it. Also know your source of manure. Depending on the animals and the time of year, some of those animals during the summer might be given a lot of salt. I'm sure you've all heard of salt licks. We don't want to be putting a lot of salt into our compost that would eventually be incorporated into our gardens. If you have a lot of fresh food scraps and you're worried about attracting flies, little fruit flies, or hardly ever do I see houseflies attracted to a compost bin, but if you're concerned, cover it with a nice layer of carbon material. It's kind of, camouflage with a couple of inches of dry material that will make it less noticeable for those two-winged creatures to seek out. Don't include in your pile diseased or insect-infested plant materials. An exception would be some years, winter going into spring, I've seen such horrible outbreaks of tiny little sucking insects called aphids on practically all kinds of plants all over the valley, in nurseries, in yards, out in the desert. If that's the case, I wouldn't be as concerned. But most other insects, I would say, do not introduce them into your compost. You don't want to have something survive, especially if your compost doesn't get to a very high temperature, that will then be spread around your garden. Do not include any fish or meat products, any bones or dairy items in your compost. Those will attract houseflies, and also they'll get stinky, as you would find with fats or oils getting rancid and just icky smelly. Weed seeds, unless you know your compost is going to get up to 150 or 60 degrees, I'd say avoid the weed seeds. They're best put in a bag and then going into your garbage receptacle. Ashes, do not include those. I grew up gardening and composting in Michigan. Soils were totally different there. Basically, we were working with more acidic soils. in the desert, we're facing high pH alkaline soils. So ash will help bump the pH. We don't want to do that. Also lime. Sometimes in Michigan, people would sprinkle a little bit of lime powder, gardening lime, in their compost, but we don't want to do that. And eggshells. Eggshells are basically calcium. If you've ever been digging and hit cement-like material in your garden, it was probably caliche, which is a calcium carbonate material, a mix of calcium carbonate and grains of sand and small rock. Nasty stuff. Now, of course, it takes hundreds, thousands of years for this material to develop, but we want to be kind to those gardeners who are coming thousands of years after us. If you have just a couple eggshells a week, that's okay. If you, however, are running a B&B and going through a couple dozen eggs a day, do not add all those eggs to your compost. No cat or dog feces. Magazines and ad inserts from newspapers that have the colored pages, don't include those. You have a higher percentage with the ink of hydrocarbons that we want to avoid adding to the compost pile. Just regular newspaper, or ideally newspaper that's printed with soy ink, is great, but not those glossy pages. Looking at our weeds. If they're young, throw them into the compost. Plus, the young ones are easier to pull up after a big rain and throw into your compost. If you've avoided them so long that they start to flower or even past flowering stage and they're developing seeds, that's definitely bad. Don't put those in. You can snap their little flowering heads off or those seed heads off and put those in the garbage. The rest of the plant with no flowers or seeds can be added to your compost though. Is anybody, one of the pride of Chandler seasonal activities is that tumbleweed tree for the holidays. Tumbleweeds are around the valley. If you spot one tumbling down the street, do not run out and grab it thinking, yay, great source of carbon. It could be a source of carbon, but also every one of those tumbleweeds is armed with thousands of seed. You don't want to be planting a whole forest of tumbleweed in your garden. If you know you're going to get hot enough that it's going to kill that tumbleweed seed, that's different. But most of us, I'd say, we don't want to have potential problems that we could easily avoid. So don't add tumbleweed. There are plants that have toxins, such as the toxic oleander. Every part of oleander is toxic. Some plants might have growth inhibitors, a chemistry in a portion of their growth, such as eucalyptus. Those leaves, they drop to the ground, they release chemicals that kind of don't allow for a lot of other plants to germinate and grow near them. Same thing, the salt cedar can do that. So if plant material has toxins or growth inhibitors, it's, I'd say, a personal choice whether to include them. If you plan to fully decompose the material in your system, get it hot enough for a long enough period that these toxins and growth inhibitors would be broken down into inert components, then it's okay. ASU did some studies that indicated fully decomposed, the toxins in oleander are no longer present. They're broken down chemically into unharmful components. So I leave that up to you as to what you would want to do, include those or not. If you want to be just fully organic in your gardening, that would include your composting. you would want to make sure you knew the source of a flower arrangement. There are more floral companies, florists that are just working with organic flower sources. Others that are more traditional florist and flower material. You'd have a lot of synthetic chemicals going in as fertilizers to pump the growth of these flowers. Some of them might even have chemicals applied to them at the time of harvest of the flowers to make them last longer and so forth. Those I would not put into the compost if you wanted to be organic. But if it's an organic flower arrangement, throw it all in. Depending on how grass is maintained, whether it's maintained with a lot of synthetic fertilizers and herbicides and so forth, or organically maintained. Some pet bedding has chemicals that are applied to deter ticks and fleas, so you'd want to know that as well. And probably if you do have pets and you've got beds and you prefer an organic lifestyle, you've probably purchased something that has organic stuffing in it. Already talked about the newspapers and coffee filters. If you are really organic, I'm sure you don't use white coffee filters because they are chemically bleached. The brown ones, they don't go through that process. And our wood chips, wood shavings, again, whether they're, if they're treated chemically, we wouldn't want to be including those. Now onto the water. So we've talked about the food. Now we'll talk about the water. We want to keep our material moist, but not soggy wet. And we don't want it to go moist, dry, moist, dry. The best to get the fastest product at the end is to maintain it from start to finish moist, like a damp, wrung out sponge. If you can grab some of your material and squeeze it and you have water drops come out of it, that's too wet. So think of that wrung out sponge. If you have too much water in your system, it will diminish the activity of the good aerobic microorganisms and anaerobic microorganisms will move in, those that can work without air. And this is where you would have a bad odor involved. If aeration is a challenge, what you can do is add more dry carbon materials and mix up that material so that it will get back to a suitable moist but not overly wet situation. So make sure again that you've got a water source. I'm so lazy, I don't think to drag the hose over and moisten my material, so I put my compost bin into my irrigation line with my shrubs, my desert shrubs. During the summer, about every 7 to 10 days, my compost bin gets some moisture. Not as often in the winter, but at least it's getting some moisture. That's better than no moisture, but still not optimal. Air. This is the other key ingredient or key component that is necessary for decomposition. You want to have sufficient air reaching all the materials or around all the materials in your bin for the microorganisms to function with. Now, turning your pile, mixing the material about once a week is great. If you are the type that you think, well, if once a week is good, I'll do it every day, that's even better. That's actually, instead of speeding things up, that's going to slow them down as much as me not turning mine often enough. Because turning it every day, you're going to be losing a lot of heat and that will slow things down. So at most 3 times a week, I'd say best would be at most twice a week, but then try to get it mixed at least once a week. So we want to get air incorporated into all around all those materials. Now, you might want to have some different tools for the process. If you have one, you don't have to purchase one of these, but if you have one, a pitchfork is great when you're just starting out. A lot of these materials are kind of, twigs and other things, even though they're kind of small, it's still hard to get a shovel in there to pick up material and turn it. So you've got lots of space there to stick in, like your fork and lift it. If not, I would suggest at least have a digging fork. This is like a great tool that can be used so many different ways in your yard. It can also be used for your compost. Again, this would be used when you've got fresher material that it can get in there and help you lift and mix that material. As the decomposition progresses, then you would want to go to a shovel. Some people like the just regular round edge shovel. To get down to the very bottom, you might want to have, good grief. You might want to have one of these flat edge shovels, because that can get right along the bottom surface of your compost bin to get every little bit of material. But when your material starts decomposing more and more, the matter gets smaller and smaller. If you're trying to mix it with a fork, digging fork, or a pitchfork, all that stuff's just going to fall through. So especially if you're trying to move it like from one bin, flip it to another, that's when you would need a shovel. There are other ways to get air into the material. You could perhaps get one of these PVC tubes that has holes drilled in it. Those holes are about, I think ½ an inch diameter. I would say if you want to use this, you set it in the middle of the bin and have the material around it. So at least some air is going down that tube and getting to the center of that material. It's not ideal, but it does help. If I were to use one of these, I would get a drill and make, at least 2 times, 3 times, maybe even 4 times the amount of holes that are present in this. There are other businesses.
Excuse me, Kirti?
Yes.
Excuse me. We have several questions here that people have, and we're about 10 after 7. So will we be able to get to those shortly?
If we want to cover some now, that's fine.
Okay. Quick question. Are roof rats attracted to compost piles?
Years and years ago, I would have said no, but just since years ago, I would say possibly. I think that would be at a time of the year where they didn't have more easily obtained materials, that they would actually try to dive into a compost bin. But when they're hard up for food. Otherwise, I'd say they wouldn't be so attracted to it. But there again, trying to mask the fragrance or aroma of fresh material would probably be wise, or definitely I'd say to have an enclosed bin to help deter their activity.
Okay, and then another person asked, and I'm guessing it has to do with if this would work. It says, how about grains after brewing beer? I'm assuming they want to know if you can use those.
Yeah, definitely. Throw those in.
Okay, and we have another one. In the winter, is there a rule of thumb on how long the decomposition process would take versus summer?
I'm glad I'm not the only one having trouble getting that word out of my it will be slower in the winter. Definitely. If you are, following your good practices of aerating. If it is in the sun through a good portion of the day, that helps also. But it overall will be a little slower than in the summer.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for answering those. Since we were getting a little late into the program, I wanted to make
Yeah.
sure if anybody needed those, if they needed to leave, they got those questions asked. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Sure. So looking at some gizmos that might help get air into the material. This one is a winged aerator. It has a main handle and a side handle. You would push this down into the material, and these wings are folded against the rod. And when you pull up, the wings will flip out and it will pull up, kind of loosen the material. The same thing with this compost crank. It looks like a giant corkscrew. So you would turn this to move it down into the compost and then just lift up. Again, it's loosening the material. It's not really turning it, but it's loosening it, and that is helping get some air into the system. With this two-sided bin, they have in between here a 4x4 post and the hardware cloth on either side of that. Even if both sides of this bin are full, you have that 4 inches of great aeration, and on the other two sides also. So it's well aerated. Even these recycled plastic enclosures I mentioned before, they have slits or slots, methods of allowing air to get in. This one, somebody had some old shade cloth, so they just kind of stuffed that between this mass of material. It just kind of opens it up, keeps it separated a little to let air enter. Now the workers, these are the microorganisms. You can add a few shovel, 1 or 2 shovelfuls of good, enriched garden soil that will kind of help give things a jump start, but don't overdo it. And I would say, and also our desert soil, it does contain these microorganisms that break things down, decompose things. They're not as numerous as they would be in a more organically rich soil, but they're there. If you are just going to use some garden soil, at most a shovelful, and sprinkle it around. A lot of our soils in our yards, it's more clayey and can compact easy. We want to make sure that things stay loose. There are commercial activators available. If you just got money to spend that you think it might be fun, you could add these, but it's not necessary. Overall, if you just add your carbon and nitrogen, eventually those microorganisms just show up. How does something start to decompose in your refrigerator when you forgot it at the back of the bin? These microorganisms, they just appear. So you don't actually have to add anything. When you start seeing fuzzies, green fuzzy material, white, even black, that's a sign that decomposition is occurring. That's a good thing. You might even come across on some more woody carbon materials, this white, filamentous stuff. You might think, oh my gosh, this is horrible. That is like one of the best things. That is fungal, what we call mycelia, that is evidence that a fungus is present and it's helping break down. So we primarily have bacteria and fungi doing the main decomposition. With the bacteria, there are aerobic and anaerobic types of bacteria. So we want to provide enough air that we've got just the aerobic bacteria working. When we have too much water with the system, that's when these guys move in and start working, and their work stinks. There, that's it. As the compost goes through stages, it's almost like a bell curve with the temperature. Starting out, you gradually warm up, and initially you have these psychrophilic bacteria. They are active at cooler temperatures. As the decomposition progresses, the activity of these microorganisms, it produces itself heat. Just like if we're working out, we're producing heat. Higher temperatures, you start to have the mesophilic group of bacteria be the primary decomposers, the primary workers at that stage. And then when it really cranks up, at temperatures of about 120 to 150, those are thermophilic, the heat-loving bacteria that are at work. Is this important to know? No, but just, for your next composting trivial pursuit game, it might be something to know about. But I just wanted you to be aware, you have different organisms that are active at different temperatures. So you want your compost to start heating up, and getting to a good 120 or 30 or 40, even up to 150 degrees. And then it will cool down as that process is finishing up. Now, how do we get it to go the fastest possible? Smaller material. The more surface area your organic, your carbon and nitrogen materials offer, the faster the microorganisms can work and break that material down. So the effort that you put up front in making those materials smaller will make their work faster. If you have kitchen scraps, don't just throw in the whole, broccoli head or whole, head of lettuce, whole onion. Make sure you at least slice them up a little bit. I love pink grapefruit juice in the winter. All those rinds, I make sure I cut them up into, 1 or 2 inch pieces. All the pulp that's left after I juice it goes into the compost also. For, twigs, branches and things, or leaves, you could invest in a shredder or chipper. There is a whole range of these, mechanisms that are available. So if you're interested in that, do some research and find out what will fit the materials that you're generating and wish to make smaller. I thought this was really cool. In one little neighborhood, 5 different families got together and purchased a nice, relatively large chipper. And if you're confident that everybody is responsible, they're maintaining the machine well and, not abuse it, this could be a great thing. And, it's got these wheels. It's easy to move it from, one home, 1 yard to another. And this can process material that's much more substantial than one of these smaller machines. In addition to the microorganisms, the bacteria and fungi, there are also macroorganisms, larger beasts that are involved in breaking down our materials. They often are in the process of breaking down larger pieces that then make it easier, give more surface area to the microorganisms. Earthworms help, pill bugs, these pill bugs and roly-polies, crickets, beetles, even roaches, things that you might think, ooh, they are making bigger pieces smaller for the microorganisms. And also as they eat, they poop. And that's a good source of nitrogen for your compost system. So don't be afraid of them. I would say every single yard in the valley has some roaches or crickets. Don't be afraid that if you have a compost bin, you will attract them. I would much rather have those creatures in the back corner, focusing on my compost material, than me, trying to get into my house. So as I say, they're everywhere anyway. You're not necessarily going to be attracting them or making their populations larger, especially if you allow your compost to get really hot, 120 degrees or so. That will kill the eggs of roaches and crickets and things. Meanwhile, they've helped decompose. This is a rather large grub that's, bigger than, even thicker than my little finger. Sorry. This is actually the young larval stage of a fig beetle. Now, the figs, they will eat overripened fruit, but they tend to like compost bins to lay their eggs in. Eggs hatch, and these grubs will feed and help decompose, break down that organic matter. I would not, if I come across these when I'm sifting to add compost to my garden bed, I would not add that to my garden bed, because they also would probably eat fresh organic matter, as in plant roots. But if I came across one, I'd throw it back in the compost or throw it someplace that a mockingbird or some other bird would make a great meal out of it. So in the compost, that's not at all a bad thing. With your temperatures, if you really want to get exact, you can purchase a compost thermometer. It's like a meat thermometer with a 2-foot long rod. The benefit of this, it's fun, for one thing, but the benefit is you can track the temperature. And remember, I say there's going to be a succession of temperature and then a drop as the material's more completely broken down. Now, if you're checking at least every few days the temperature, and all of a sudden the temperature drops, that is most likely a really good indication that you should have turned the material a day or a couple days ago. If the air starts getting depleted within all that material, then the system can't support as many microorganisms. So some of them die off and the process slows down. You turn it, that temperature is probably going to fly back up. So overall, stockpile, gather enough material until you've got about a cubic yard to get you on a good start. And you can have just open piles, or you could more discreetly stockpile your material in bins or painted trash cans. But getting enough material to get you really set to complete the process. From there, you have the stage of decomposition, and then the finished material. This was on a garden tour. You do not have to have a sign declaring that your compost is finished in your own garden. But once it hits that really high temperature, and then the temperature naturally starts to lower, that indicates that primarily that breaking down is tapering off, and let the temperature cool some, and then, pardon me, then it will be ready to add into your garden beds. Oh,
Excuse me, Kirti.
yes.
Sorry, giving you a 5-minute warning. It's actually 7:26, and we need to wrap this up in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yep. So overall, you will end up with much less finished compost than the materials that you started with. You're only going to have about 25, 30, 40% of the mass that you started with. The decomposition, if something's fully decomposed, you're not going to be able to tell what it was when it started out. The end result, if something is totally broken down, is what we call humus. And that's a dark, rich, kind of crumbly material. Smells earthy. I'd say it almost looks like coffee grounds. You can use sifters to get any large chunks of material that aren't fully decomposed removed from the material that you're ready to add into your garden. And if there are pieces that aren't sufficiently decomposed, just throw them back in and give them some more time in the bin. You know, if everything's like cranked up, you might get something in about, 6 weeks or even 2 months. But generally, I'd say it's going to be a good maybe 3, 4, 5 months when you get a finished product. Certainly, fibrous materials like agave leaves, pine, banana peels, those things will definitely take longer to decompose. Just leave them longer, throw them back in if you need to. Now, this material is great for adding into your vegetable garden or herb garden. It will enhance the soil structure, releases some small amounts of nutrients so that you've got better aeration for your plant roots. Water can more easily percolate and be maintained, also for your plants to absorb. And overall, you won't need to, I'd say we always need to be adding fertilizer to our desert vegetable gardens, but you won't need to add as much. And over time, adding compost to our desert soil will help kind of buffer and bring the pH from higher alkaline closer to a neutral, which is very beneficial for our vegetable gardens. Now, this is a material that you don't want to incorporate it into the backfill soil when you're planting desert plants, but you can certainly put it around the top to eventually be incorporated slowly, gradually, more naturally into the soil. And sometimes you might find different mushrooms popping up in your garden, your vegetable garden. This is not a scary thing. It's just that there's organic material that a fungal species has come across, and it's just helping break it down more completely. So that is the basic dirt on compost. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I hope you will find the handout useful. There are some more reference materials that you can perhaps access that are listed on your handout.
Thank you so much, Kirti, for an amazing presentation as usual. And thank you to everyone for attending our workshop today. We appreciate you taking that time. So here on the slide, you'll find our city and town websites for more information or resources, along with our contact information. We do have a short survey about our Composting 101 class that will pop up once you exit. We do appreciate if you would please take a moment to complete that for us so we can use it to continue improving our classes for you in the future. And thank you again, and we hope everyone enjoys the rest of their week.